and welcome. My name is Daniel Rothenberg, and I am co-director of the Future Security Initiative, which is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. We're thrilled that you're joining us to hear from Michael Lind, who is really, we're particularly pleased to have Mike with us because he is one of the three founders of New America. So he's a legendary person in our universe, and is here to talk about a book that he wrote in 2006 called American Way of Strategy, and to kind of look at some of those arguments and contextualize them, see how relevant they are and what they have to say to our current situation. Michael Lind is, he became New America's first fellow. We now support, through our Future Security Initiative, 3 to 4 fellows every year. You'll hear from some of them later this year. And before creating New America, he was the executive editor of The National Interest, an editor and Washington correspondent at Harper's Magazine, a senior editor at The New Republic, and a staff writer at The New Yorker. With Ted Halstead, who also was one of the other founders of New America, he wrote New America's manifesto called The Radical Center, published in 2001. He's also the author of Made in Texas, George W. Bush and the Southern Takeover of American Politics. He's currently professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. So thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. Mike is going to talk for a little bit about some of the key ideas in the American Way of Strategy. Then I will come back in and we'll have a discussion, and we'll have time for Q&A from all of you. And so thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you, Professor Rothenberg. One correction, I'm no longer at the University of Texas at Austin. I've been a freelance writer since 2022. But I'm particularly pleased to discuss my book. I'll flog it here, The American Way of Strategy, U.S. Foreign Policy and the American Way of Life. I wrote this, well, let me begin by saying my background is in foreign policy. I studied international relations and got a master's degree in IR with Paul Kennedy and others at Yale. I went on to be assistant to the director of the Center for the Study of Foreign Affairs at the State Department, a little think tank in the Foreign Service Institute during the Gulf War. And although my interest turned to other topics, they've always been related to nation building, and there's always been a national interest, internationalist dimension to it. And so I set down my thinking in the American Way of Strategy in the early 2000s, inspired by something that Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, who's a great scholar as well as a great politician, drew my attention to. And it was a speech that President Woodrow Wilson gave after World War I, when he was trying to persuade the American people and the Senate in particular, he's trying to get the Senate to approve of the Versailles Treaty after World War I, so that the United States would become a founding member of the League of Nations. Now, the way I had been taught this, and I think it was commonly taught this way, was that Wilson was an idealist, and that there were no power political or social aspects to his thinking. He just wanted to create a world of democracies, and was a bit utopian in his approach to things. And while Wilson can be criticized, you get a quite different perspective from a particular speech that he gave to an audience in St. Louis on September 5th, 1919, during a nationwide tour to drum up support for the League of Nations, during the course of which he had a stroke from which he never recovered. And so I'm just going to beg your indulgence and read from Wilson's speech. He says, "We must be physically ready for anything to come." He's talking about if there is an endless cycle of great power wars in the future that are not averted by the League of Nations as he hoped. "We must be physically ready for anything to come. We must have a great standing army. We must see to it that every man in America is trained to arms. We must see to it that there are munitions and guns enough for an army that means a mobilized nation. You have got to think of the President of the United States not as the chief counselor of the nation, elected for a little while, but as the man meant constantly and every day to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. And you know what the effect of a military government is upon social questions. You know how impossible it is to effect social reform if everybody must be under orders from the government. You know how impossible it is, in short, to have a free nation if it is a military nation and under military orders. Now, this passage from Wilson's speech struck me as it struck Senator Moynihan, because here you had President Wilson, who presided over the mobilization of the United States and of the conscription of the entire US economy and economic base for the duration of World War I. And he's saying this is a bad thing. And we must try to do everything we can in our foreign policy to prevent the US from ever having to wage another world war because it's so harmful to liberty at home. And he knew from experience the Wilson administration was rather repressive. Wilson arrested and jailed the socialist candidate for the president of the United States, Eugene Debs. The Wilson administration cracked down on dissent at homes, but you see that there's this note of remorse after the war, where Wilson still thinks some of this is necessary, but the only way to avoid it is to create conditions in the world that make it unnecessary to have the US constantly mobilized for war again. So that's what got me started on a sort of a detective story. I then turned to this famous address, The Chance for Peace, in 1953 by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And we've often heard from his farewell address about the danger of the military-industrial complex. Both libertarians and leftists have often quoted him out of context when he says, in the Council of Government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. So Eisenhower, who knew the military-industrial complex, he had been the commander of the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II under General Marshall, and then he was commander-in-chief for 8 years as president. So he was sincere about that, but you have to put it in the context of Eisenhower's thinking, which was strikingly similar to that of Woodrow Wilson. So in this earlier talk, in April 16th, 1953, Eisenhower said that the amassing of Soviet power is forcing the US and other nations, quote, to spend unprecedented money and energy for armaments, unquote. Now, this is the commander of the D-Day invasion, and he's the commander-in-chief of the US Armed Forces as president of the United States. But he thinks we're spending too much on the military. He says, what can the world or any nation in it hope for if no turning is found on this dread road? The worst is atomic war. The best would be this: a life of perpetual fear and tension, a burden of arms draining the wealth and the labor of all peoples, a wasting of strength that defies the American system or the Soviet system or any system to achieve true abundance and happiness for the peoples of this earth. So he sounds a lot like Woodrow Wilson in 1919. They're both concerned that American society will be over-militarized. But here's something else they share in common. They don't see this militarization as the result of a domestic plot. It's not the result of an internal conspiracy, even by the military-industrial complex. It's not because war profiteers and defense contractors are creating imaginary foreign threats in order to boost their congressional appropriations. So for both Wilson and Eisenhower, there are objective external threats. They are quite real. The threat of another world war in Europe, according to Wilson, was real. The threat of a Soviet victory in the Cold War, according to Eisenhower, was real. So this defensive militarization was forced upon the United States, but nevertheless, it came at a terrible price, according to both Wilson and Eisenhower. Now, the last thing I'll read for you is from a famous memo, NSC 68, written by the senior staff of the National Security Council under the leadership of Paul Nitze, who was the head of policy planning in the State Department, and whom I had the privilege to know. So in 1950, NSC 68 was sort of set forth for internal consumption in the Truman administration, a vision of American grand strategy in what was in the Cold War, then we now know as the early Cold War. Now, as state papers go, as policy position papers go, NSC 68 is very odd. It begins with a statement of the fundamental purpose of the United States. And as I say in the American Way strategy, it is hard to imagine a British or French strategic memorandum beginning with the fundamental purpose of Britain or the fundamental purpose of France. But according to NSC 68, the fundamental purpose of the United States is laid down in the preamble to the Constitution: to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. And then they continue, in essence, the fundamental purpose is to assure the integrity and vitality of our free society, which is founded upon the dignity and worth of the individual. So by this point, you and perhaps Harry Truman are wondering, well, that's nice, but what does that have to do with US foreign policy? Well, the document explains. 3 realities emerge as a consequence of this purpose: our determination to maintain the essential elements of individual freedom as set forth in the Constitution and Bill of Rights, our determined to create conditions under which our free and democratic system can live and prosper, and our determination to fight, if necessary, to defend our way of life. And then they go on to explain how Soviet hegemony in Eurasia would threaten the American way of life. As the Soviet Union mobilized the military resources of Eurasia, increased its relative military capabilities, and heightened its threat to our security, some would be tempted to accept peace on its terms, while many would seek to defend the United States by creating a regimented system which would permit the assignment of a tremendous part of our resources to defense. Under such a state of affairs, our national morale would be corrupted and the integrity and vitality of our system subverted. So NSC 68 is making the same argument in different language that President Wilson made in 1919 and that President Eisenhower made in 1953, which is, we need to shape conditions in the world to minimize external dangers, because if the external danger is too great, then the American way of life, based on a essentially civilian society, market economy, lots of individual liberty, will either be sacrificed to what the Yale political scientist Harold Laswell called a garrison state, or the United States would become what I call in the American way of strategy, a tributary state. That is, we would be able to maintain the American way of life at home only by appeasing this more powerful power or combination of powers abroad. And so there you have 3 separate occasions where you have major American leaders or policymakers from World War I all the way through the Cold War saying that the purpose of the American way of strategy is to prevent the excessive militarization of American society and the American economy. So that's when I knew I had a book. And we can turn to conversation, but I want to read you one more statement where I think this idea was lost. And I think it's kind of dropped out of the consciousness of American policymakers from the 1960s to the 2020s. And where it was lost was in the inaugural address of President John F. Kennedy, where he said, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty." So that, in my argument, is a radical departure from this thesis that was shared by Wilson, by NSA in the Truman years, and then by President Eisenhower. So Kennedy says we will pay any price to ensure the survival and the success of liberty. Presumably liberty anywhere in the world, not just in the American Republic. Now that's a nice thought, but it's not what Wilson and Eisenhower and Paul Nitze and his colleagues were talking about. They were talking about the American way of life in the United States. They were not talking about an open-ended crusade to bring democracy to the rest of the planet. Nice as it would be if you could do that by means short of a world war or imperialism, but that was not the goal of American strategy in their view. And there's also this abandonment of the caution of wartime presidents, Wilson and Eisenhower, when Kennedy, who himself was a very courageous war hero in World War II as a young man, where he says, "We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship." So for Wilson and Eisenhower, if you're in a situation where the United States has to pay any price, bear any burden, and meet any hardship, then it's made some really bad strategic mistakes, because the purpose of foreign policy is to avoid getting into such a situation. So with that, we can turn to a conversation with, if that's okay with Professor Rothenberg. I'm sorry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Hey, thank you so much. That was a really excellent, introduction to the book. I think it's particularly interesting, we'll talk about this a little bit, that you wrote this, or at least it was published in 2006, at a time when the US was embroiled in some set of crises that are different than the current ones. But it's called The American Way of Strategy, and you say right in the beginning of the book, the purpose of the American Way of Strategy has always been to defend the American way of life. So could you just give us a little overview? What does that mean? What's this thing, the American way of life, and how does that guide the American way of strategy?
Well, I developed the concept of Republican liberty. This is a phrase that George Washington uses in his farewell address. It's used throughout the early Republic. And in the late 20th century, a number of scholars revived the concept. So the idea is that there are two different conceptions of liberty. One is the absence of constraint. And that's, so if you're left alone by the government or by society, then you're free. The idea of Republican liberty, which comes out of what scholars like Quentin Skinner and others and Mike and call the neo-Roman conception of liberty, going back to the Roman Republic, is that you are not free if anyone has the potential to constrain your personal liberty in the future. So in other words, if you're a slave or a servant or a serf, and you have a nice master or feudal lord who lets you do what you want, then technically you're free, or you have license to do as you please. But at any moment, that overlord can crack down and withdraw your liberty, right? And so in this neo-Roman Republican conception of liberty, that cannot even be a possibility. So in domestic politics, you have to arrange things so that you have a republic. It doesn't have to be a democratic republic. They weren't democratic in the past, but there have to be checks and balances so that no one figure, there's no Caesar, right? There's no all-powerful emperor or dictator, so that no one group or elite can just take away the liberty of the citizens, even if for a while they let the citizens do what they want to. But there's always this lurking potential for oppression there. You have to arrange things domestically. Now, applied to foreign policy, this means you want a world order in which no foreign country can oppress you with its immense power. And the power can be economic, it can be social, it doesn't have to be, hard military power. And so we've been having this debate since the COVID epidemic in particular, which exposed the extent of America's industrial dependence on China, which some of us have been running around with our hair on fire screaming about for the last 30 years and being ignored. But finally, the establishment, both parties, starts waking up to this, right? So if we're totally dependent, for China, not just on personal protective equipment, but on basic things like precursors to drugs, we no longer manufacture these things in the US. What happens if they cut off the supply, right? At that point, in purely economic terms, that's why foreign policy is about economics, not just about military hardware. The US has the economic and industrial equivalent of the dilemma in SC 68. Either we appease China and beg them to give us our medicine and our personal protective equipment, and our iPhones and so on, or at great cost, we have a massive, rapid wartime-like mobilization of industry in order to become more economically independent, right? So the idea is to avoid two things. First, you avoid allowing an overwhelming concentration of economic and population power outside of the United States. And means Eurasia, at least for now. Africa maybe in the 22nd or 23rd centuries, but in our lifetimes, it's Eurasia. And that was the goal, according to realists, of the world wars, the three world wars, the two hot ones and the Cold War, which was a slow motion world war that was fought by arms races and proxy wars and sabotage and espionage, not directly between the US and the USSR. So the realists are right about that, but what I think a lot of, and I consider myself a realist, but what a lot of American realists neglect is this theme that was emphasized by Wilson and Eisenhower and Paul Nitze, which is that the goal of American foreign policy is not just physical security, it's the integrity of a democratic republic, meaning a fairly decentralized, largely civilian, federal, highly civil libertarian society, which is incompatible with long-term mobilization for warfare, including economic war at a high level.
So you wrote the book, or the book came out in 2006, a time when globalization, as we call it now, was quite popular and embraced by many. And a lot of what you've just mentioned has been a security argument that's at least suspicious of globalization, and that globalization pushes out relationships all across the world and makes individual societies dependent on free global trade. So how do you think of the book you wrote and your ideas as they relate to this idea of globalization? Are you suggesting a sort of counter-globalization narrative?
Well, at the time, the premise was I had been in favor of industrial policy for security reasons, not for jobs in the Midwest or anything, in the 1980s and 1990s. We had a big debate. My side lost under Clinton and Bush. The so-called free traders won. What they call free trade is not actually free trade. It's really offshoring of production to China and Mexico and Vietnam and Thailand or so on. About a third of what is called trade in the modern world consists of intra-industry trade within the same industry, and much of it is intra-firm trade. In other words, one part of a product is made in Mexico, another part is made in Canada, another in China, and then it's all assembled, in a fourth country. So this is not really trade in the classical sense, but this was called free trade. The consensus in both parties, on the Clinton Democrats and the Bush Republicans, and this consensus started to crack with the Great Recession of 2008, which was really a Great Depression. We called it a recession. And it finally, I think, died. Well, it died on the right with Trump, and it died I think even for many Democrats with the COVID epidemic, with the exposure of our dependency on China. But before that, this period from about 1996 to 2016, is like a 20-year period. The consensus in Washington, and I was there, was that that economics and trade and national security are totally separate subjects because there will be no great power conflicts anymore. The United States will be the world's only superpower. We have this amazing, we have more, ships and fleets and so on than the rest of the world combined. And the only threats in the future, you remember this, Professor Rothenberg, states like North Korea and Iraq, and super terrorists, empowered terrorists like Bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And China would see the wisdom of specializing, like Japan and South Korea, in manufacturing and giving up any global geopolitical dreams. They would be content, basically, to let the U.S. Navy patrol the waters of the Western Pacific and to look after China's interests. There was a name for this doctrine. I'm not caricaturing it. This was called the reassurance doctrine in a policy paper of the first Bush administration, George Herbert Walker Bush, following around the time of the Gulf War, 1991, with Paul Wolfowitz and others penned it. It's a thoughtful document. I mean, these are brilliant people, and this was their attempt at a grand strategy. And what they argued was that the U.S. should persuade potential rivals, and they mentioned China and Russia, or they had them in mind, they didn't necessarily mention them, to that the U.S. will look after their security interests. And that they're better off if Uncle Sam polices the world, including their own neighborhoods, right? The U.S. will police Russia's neighborhood. The U.S. will police China's neighborhood. And like Japan and South Korea and Germany after World War II, they will specialize in being civilian powers. And as I say, make cars, not wars, right? So the U.S. will export soldiers and police the sea lanes. And then over the sea lanes will come manufactured goods to the consumers in America. And it's a theory. I mean, this was plausible, arguably, in the 1990s and the 2000s. The Western establishment began to reconsider it as early as the 2010s, when a Chinese policy document, and note that a lot of what I'm talking about are strategic documents, whether by the US government or China. These are important. These are position papers, right? They're strategic guidances. China had a document called China 2025, in which the government of Xi Jinping declared, this is for internal purposes, although it was leaked, China is not going to remain a low-wage, low productivity manufacturer of goods for the Americans and Europeans and Japanese, like Mexico. We are going to catch up with them and surpass them in every single area of industry, including advanced technology. Well, this came as a huge shock to people I know in Silicon Valley and in Washington, because China had basically said, we're going to replace Silicon Valley. We're going to replace Wall Street. We're going to be a true superpower in every single dimension. So globalization, I think, was always premised on the idea of an unmatched US military superiority. The US would be so superior militarily that China and Russia, maybe India in the future, other great powers, just wouldn't even think about competing militarily, right? They would just specialize in commerce.
There's also a rule-based component of all this, right? You think of like the World Trade Organization and its construction of a whole system that's supposed to enable the movement of goods and services and remove, states' own potential barriers that might prop up their own industries, et cetera. So, in some ways, your book is very much an argument in favor of a rule-based order, but one part of that rule-based order was economic, creating these mechanisms that made it difficult for states to legally protect their own industries through tariffs and other sorts of actions. So, yeah, how do you reflect on all of that? It wasn't only the security side, it was a whole idea that this global system of trade had to have a legal infrastructure supported by all the state parties.
Well, that was the idea, and it was developed most eloquently by Professor John Eikenberry at Princeton and some others. And President Bill Clinton made this case sometimes. For example, Clinton, on at least one occasion I remember, he said the United States is not going to be the dominant world power forever. What we can do is place a set of institutions and rules which will allow us to retire gracefully. But then the rising power, presumably China, will then play by the rules that were established when it was weak. And they'll see that these rules are in its interest. I never believed this, simply as a student of history. That is, I can't think of a single case in world history in which a rising power replacing a previous hegemonic power, so for example, the US replacing Britain in the 20th century, decided to play by the rules and use the institutions of the declining power. The rising power creates its own rules and its own institutions at that moment. It doesn't say, well, there's this great system that's been working for 70 years or 200 years, let's just not tinker with it. The US, this rule-based world order is that of the Pax Americana. I mean, we created it essentially by coercion. I mean, we got the British and the French and the nationalist Chinese to sign up for it in the Security Council and the United Nations and all of that. But the US was running the show. We rigged all of the global institutions, the World Bank and the Security Council, to make sure the US had a veto in the Security Council, to make sure in all of these international UN agencies, there's a weighted vote based on the financial contributions, not based on the equality of countries, okay? Because the US had half of the world's GDP in 1946. And so the rule-based world order that people rhapsodize about, I think was, as the old saying goes, the golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rules, okay? And we had the gold and the guns in 1946. And so I was always skeptical of the idea that a superpower China or a superpower India in the future would say, well, let's just inherit this system that the Americans and their British advisors and a few others came up with in the middle of the 20th century. I don't think it works that way. And what's more, as a realist, an economic realist, I've never believed that you can have a system of global free trade, an integrated global market, if you have rival great powers. For the very simple reason, it's obvious, you're not going to want to be dependent on your potential enemy that you might fight a war with, or that you indeed are fighting a proxy war with right now. So you're going to have preferential treatments towards your allies in trade, but you're going to have sanctions, embargoes, trade wars, espionage, sabotage, et cetera, towards your hot war enemy or your cold war enemy. So what I've tried to do in the book, and what I'm trying to do in my argument now, is that the era of globalization and this dream of a Pax Americana in the 90s and 2000s, it was not like some kind of conspiracy by neoconservatives or, Davos man or whatever. I mean, there was a strategic logic to it. So their error was the error of the head, not of the heart. So if the United States had really been the world's only superpower in 1989, after the end of the Cold War, in the sense that the US had been the world's only superpower, really, globally, not in Eurasia, where the Red Army was a big factor, but in the world. If in 1989, the US had 50% of global GDP, as it did in 1945, yeah, in that case, I think that this kind of neoliberal globalist vision would have made sense maybe for 50 or 100 years until, eventually somebody caught up. So I think they simply made an intellectual error. And I warned against this in the book. I mean, I wasn't right about everything, but I was right about this, that they were way too optimistic about the probability that this period of American industrial domination, which translates into military domination, would last. I'll give you an example. One last thought, something I just learned a few hours ago. Russia now has, Russia alone, post-Soviet Russia, the nation state of Russia, has the potential to create, to make twice as many munitions, like bullets, as the US and Europe combined. Right now, at this moment, in October 2024, we have half of the munitions capacity of one country, Russia. To forget China mobilizing, its industrial base, which has been the largest in the world now for years. So I think a lot of the champions of this rule-based global market under benign American policing, that seemed plausible at the time, but frankly, they were just far too optimistic.
So what's the next phase then? What do you see, a new, let's call it a Cold War or some other sort of great power conflict that requires a strategic readjustment? And if that's the case, what should that be?
Well, this is what I go into in the rest of the American way of strategy. We have a choice. None of these things are forced on us. The United States will be one of the dominant powers in the world for ages to come. I mean, it's not going anywhere, right? Even if there are two or three other powers as well of the same scale. And we've always had a choice. We had a choice in the 20th century. We could have stayed out of the world wars. We could have appeased Russia and stayed out of and not had a Cold War. And so that's where this factor of the American way of life comes in. And it's something that is usually not discussed in foreign policy, either by realists or by so-called idealists. But this is where I think these alternatives of the democratic republic, of the garrison state, of the tributary state, and of what I call the castle society, these are different options for the United States, and each corresponds to a different foreign policy.
Could you just go over really briefly, if possible, like those particular terms and what they mean and how they reflect on this question of American way of strategy?
Yeah, so the American dream, I argue in my book, is the democratic republic. And we've touched on this earlier. It's a society that is fairly decentralized, has checks and balances. You have an adequate military and adequate executive authority, but the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, not of the entire society. So it's fairly loose, flexible, civil libertarian, decentralized, market-based kind of society. That's the American way of life that Wilson and Eisenhower and Nitze and his colleagues wanted to preserve. So there are three different American nightmares, not just one. So the one that is most commonly discussed by opponents of American foreign policy is the garrison state. That's the idea that we will intervene excessively abroad or against exaggerated threats or imaginary enemies. And this will turn the US into a regimented state. So for example, you would have to bring back the draft. You would have to, all the way up until the end of the Cold War, every president had constantly updated. Little known fact, the phone numbers of all of the CEOs of the major industrial corporations, in case things got bad, and the president would have to call these CEOs and mobilize the civilian economy for war. So they'd have to stop making cars, crank out ships and rockets and aircraft again, like in World War I. Fortunately, never got to that stage in the Cold War, but that was the default Garrison state type operation. Now, we had a garrison state for a couple of years in World War I, and then for the duration of World War II. We never really approached one, even at the height of the Cold War, because the US never spent more than about 15% of its GDP on defense, even in Korea and in Vietnam. So as expensive as it wasn't the 50% of GDP we spent on the military in World War II, when we really did have a war economy, or even in World War I. But so the garrison state is that World War I, World War II type total mobilization indefinitely, right? For 10, 15, 20, 200 years. And that's the end of civilian liberty and of capitalism, because of the necessity of the government to direct production. The second nightmare is the tributary state. This is where some hostile power, you don't stop them in time, and it amasses a bloc or an empire in the rest of the world that is so powerful that resistance is futile, right? And so the US just tries to cut the best deal it can and trade with them on their terms, because we're negotiating from a position of weakness, of censoring ourselves, because they get upset whenever a journalist in America publishes insults their leaders. So we see to it that the journalist, is squelched. But other than that, we still have a fair degree of civilian liberty, and the government's not too big and all of that. In the Cold War, the term for this was Finlandization. So Finland, during the Cold War, right next to the Soviet Union, preserved its independence by being neutral in the Cold War. It didn't join NATO. It joined NATO recently as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but during the Cold War, it was neutral. Austria was as well. And so internally, they had democratic republics, but externally, they had to appease these greater powers, which told them what they could and could not do in their foreign policy. So that's the tributary state. And the final example is the garrison society, where it's a society, not the state, because the state is so weak. Not only is it incompetent in foreign policy, it can't defend
the castle society. Sorry.
Castle society. I'm sorry, the castle society. Thank you. The castle society is one where the government can't control its own borders. It can't defend the territory. Its army is too weak. And the police can't defend the citizens. So essentially you get armed enclaves and gated communities and so on. And this is not uncommon in large areas in the world, in parts of Latin America and Africa and the Middle East and Asia. You have these castle societies. They're not failed states necessarily. It's not necessarily like, Ethiopia or Somalia or Lebanon and at their worst periods. But it's just a very weak state. And the state is so weak that you can't have a grand strategy, because why? There's no state to have a grand strategy, right? To have a foreign policy at all. So I think, okay, let's go forward. Well, we want to avoid the castle society, right? We want to have a minimal, and I won't get into domestic politics, but there is a question of whether the US has the capacity or the willpower to actually control its borders at this stage, right, in American history, and there are policy disputes about this. But we don't want to be a castle society. We don't want to be a garrison state. We could maintain this kind of civilian free American way of life while dismantling our military and shrinking it to like the Coast Guard and being a purely defensive military, and essentially ceding the rest of the world to the other great powers, which for the foreseeable future, the hostile great powers or potentially hostile, it won't be any of the Western European countries. It will be China, Russia, maybe India down the road, because, India is now the most populous nation and it's catching up rapidly in industrial and military terms, and they're fairly well disposed towards us now, but you never know, right, in 50 or 100 years. So then the question, well, if we reject these options, if we want to build on the American way of strategy and use American military, diplomatic, and economic power to shape a world order that minimizes the kinds of threats from other great powers that would force us preemptively to assemble a voluntary garrison state, or the alternative, just to appease our enemies and adopt a tributary state. What's the best way to do that? Now, my argument is what I call a concert balance strategy. And it's had some effect in the political science literature. If you Google it, Patrick Porter and others have adopted this and tried to introduce it on a small scale into the term of international relations. So what I mean by a concert balance strategy. So a concert of powers is a period in which you have multiple great powers, but they don't have any major conflicts with each other, and they agree to exercise basically a joint hegemony, either in they have their own spheres of influence, but the world as a whole, the great powers get together and negotiate to avoid conflicts among themselves. And examples of that are the Concert of Europe between the Crimean War and World War I, where the Balkan crisis that triggered World War I was like the fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth Balkan crisis. There have been other Balkan crises, but they didn't lead to a world war. They could have, but under this Concert of Europe model, at the French and the Germans and the Russians negotiated, and they came to a settlement at some point and imposed some kind of solution on the Balkans. The Balkan people tended to be the subjects of this, not the agents, but that's how peace was preserved, and it broke down in World War I. So if you could, you would want every great power in the world to be part of this concert. Now, I call it a concert balance strategy because if one great power or several of them becomes aggressive and decides that it's going to overthrow the system and unilaterally and aggressively expand its power, then you have a pre-existing balance of power alliance among the other members of the concert. But the goal of the balance of power strategy is not to eliminate the great power as a great power forever. For one thing, you just can't do that. I mean, we're talking about giant, the world wars did not eliminate Germany as the largest, Western European central power, and the Cold War did not eliminate Russia. So any system of power politics in the two biggest European nations, and Russia is a European nation, are Russia and Germany, and China and India are going to be the biggest Asian countries, and the US is going to be the biggest country in the Northern Hemisphere, North America. So the goal of your Cold War, you hope it doesn't escalate to hot war, is not to completely annihilate the power of your rival, because your rival in this conflict may be your ally in the next one. This is why you have to think in terms of decades and generations. You can't just think in terms of next year, okay? And this has been a mistake that the United States has done. So we built up Stalin's power for the short-term goal of annihilating the Third Reich, and that was the right thing to do. But so suddenly now, the Red Army dwarfs the armies of the British and the French and the Americans, right? Who demobilized after World War II. So now we have a problem. But China, in the latter Cold War in the 80s and 90s, to weaken the Soviet Union, and it worked. The Soviet Union collapsed and became this rump Russia, which is still powerful, but it's just a regional power. So now we're thinking, oh my God, what are we going to do? China is now this much more powerful than we thought it would be. So you have to bear that in a multipolar world, and we're going to be in a multipolar world, the US simply has 4% of the world's population and about a quarter of the world's GDP and shrinking. Not for anything that we're doing, but simply because the rest of the world is industrializing and getting richer. It's inevitable. So there's going to be this great power club. This is the alternative, by the way, Professor Rothenberg, to the rule-based world order. It's the club-based world order, you might call it, right? There's members of the club. It's a very hierarchical system. To be a member of the club, you have to be a great power. Okay, Switzerland, too small. Netherlands, too small. China, India, and also in the long run, Russia, Germany, some European powers, Japan, will hack it. Maybe some African country in the future, but Brazil maybe. But to be a member of the Great Power Club, there are club rules. They don't necessarily include, unlimited free trade and investment, or they're not necessarily economic rules. They're just rules of the game. And if you're too aggressive, we will suspend your membership temporarily. But if you reform, then you will be readmitted as a member of the club in good standing.
So on Europe, we've already come up with one answer, right? We have the European Union and its various mechanisms of binding together these smaller states. But we don't have much time left, so let's just, if those in attendance have questions, please just drop them into the Q&A box in Zoom. You do mention towards the end of the book, you write, the greatest threat to the American way of life has always been the possibility that the American people reluctantly might jettison their democratic Republican government and social order in order to obtain security. So that's a big claim, but how might you reflect on this question of the American people's potential own actions to damage our country's capacity to, protect American way of life and this broader idea of strategy?
Oh, I have great confidence in the American people. I think generally, when they've had leaders explaining the importance of some kinds of U.S. intervention abroad, then public opinion it tends to follow leaders. The public mass opinion, as political scientists know, is kind of incoherent for the simple reason most people are going about their lives. They're not thinking about American grand strategy and so on. So they tend to defer to the leaders of their or to foreign policy experts in any given time. So I think that being the case, I'm much more worried about a misguided elite consensus than I am about the American people overruling the foreign policy experts. I think the foreign policy experts got it very, very badly wrong in both trade and in strategy in the 1990s and the 2000s. And my sentence about the American people demanding a garrison state for protection, that's just sort of trying my effort to boil down to one sentence what I think Eisenhower and Wilson and Nixon and others were talking about. That is, if the world outside is too dangerous, whether because of great powers on our borders, policing the sea lanes, the Russians had, in the Cold War, they had submarines in Chesapeake Bay, right? We've had these incidents recently with squadrons of drones buzzing. Have you followed this? Buzzing American military installations. So who could this be? Well, I'm not going to speculate, but you can guess, right? These civilian drones, this is some kind of espionage. So the danger is if people panic, then they will demand that we round up the ethnic enemies of usually the diaspora of the foreign country. It was German Americans in World War I. It was Japanese Americans in World War II. In like an extreme crisis with China, it would be all Chinese Americans or potential threats and so on. So that's one of the dangers. And the other danger is that you get military power and foreign threats used. Essentially, there's a bidding war among politicians to, instead of calming people down, saying that there's a real danger, we will survive it, we will prevail, basically riling people up in panic. And I think we've been lucky so far in the 20th century that we had leaders, particularly in Franklin Roosevelt and in Truman and Eisenhower, but also Kennedy, Johnson, and Reagan, and even Nixon. They always said we can win this, right? We'll be tough, but we can prevail over the Cold War. And at the end of the day, the Russian people are not our enemies. They're potential allies and trading partners. So to my mind, that's the threat. It's that we will be so weak that when our weakness is exposed, there will be an overreaction to the other extreme.
So a related question here from Arnulfo Acedo Jr. Isolationism and nationalism perspectives have been on the rise in the U.S., and many U.S. citizens want America to stay out of forever wars and to decrease foreign aid. With this inward rise of thinking, what do you think America's foreign policy looks like in the next few years, possibly with even a new administration, or there will be a new administration? So,
well, my problem is there are real isolationists. I know a few of them. They tend to be libertarians. Okay, they really want the U.S. not to have any military at all. and just the Coast Guard and so on. And maybe the Border Patrol, though libertarians tend to want open borders, so maybe not even the Border Patrol. I don't like the terms isolationism and nativism because these are used by Council on Foreign Relations types to stigmatize people who simply disagree with their rather expansive vision of the Atlantic Alliance and of global Pax Americana and all of that. So whatever you think of former President Trump, he's not an isolationist. I would consider him a unilateralist. He's a transactionist. If you look at his statements, and they're often inflammatory and belligerent and in my view misguided, but he doesn't want to get rid of an alliance with Europe, but he wants to intimidate them into spending more for their defense, which is what every single US president has tried to do since Eisenhower. They all tried to get Europeans to raise the share of European GDP going to defense so that American taxpayers could pay less. So I don't see a great surge of like interwar isolationism in the US. What I do see is a wariness with the wars of choice of the Bush era in particular. That were then, so we had George W. Bush, basically came in saying we would have a more restrained foreign policy, and then 9/11 happens. So he goes after al-Qaeda, which was entirely justified in Afghanistan, but then he invades Iraq, which had nothing whatsoever to do with al-Qaeda, and was the Iraqi regime was the enemy of Salafist jihadism. So then the public gets wary of Bush's wars. So then there's a turn to Barack Obama, who says, I'm going to end the forever wars. And then he starts two more in Syria and Libya. So we now got 4 wars in running, okay? And then the public turns to Trump, who, to his credit, in my view, didn't add any 5th or 6th war, right? And laid the groundwork for what became winding down the Afghan war. I think the way we left Afghanistan was disastrous to America's reputation. But on the other hand, we did need to leave at some point. We can't stay there, for another 20 years. So I think there's a wariness with these peripheral wars. Now, where does Ukraine fit into this? I would say Ukraine is the first proxy war in Cold War II. We are now in the second Cold War and have been for some time. The main cause is the rise of China and the encouragement it gives to revisionist powers like Russia and Iran to be more aggressive than they would be if China was not backing them informally, economically, and diplomatically, and with the military in some. So that's the big change. If I were writing the book now, my prescriptions would be different.
So really briefly, we're just coming to the end, but do you, if you're comfortable doing this, can you give us some outlines of what the U.S. grand strategy ought to be, but quickly if possible, and give us a little something to think about as we end the evening's event?
Well, I would be a charlatan as a foreign policy thinker if I could not. So yes, I do have an answer. I think at this point, we need to balance, not contain, but balance a rising China, both on the military realm and the industrial realm. And to do this, we need to assemble a coalition, not of weak countries, but of the other major great powers in the world. And we're doing this to some degree. Obama has continued to some degree under Trump and Biden, and maybe under Harris or Trump. We'll see who wins the election. I don't think our foreign policy will be that radically different. So for example, India and the US, we have the Quad, the US, UK, Australia, and India in the Pacific, quietly balancing China. You can add Vietnam to that, a minor regional power. I think at this point, in the future, if we could, we would want to separate Russia from a close embrace with China. Probably that's not possible until after there's an outcome to the Ukraine war, and possibly until Putin is out of office. But so in the long run, I think we can be fairly confident that the threat of China, to the extent that it's a threat, will be checked not by the US only, but by the rise of the rest of the world, in particular the rise of India will check China. And also, it's in our interest to help develop Africa as quickly as we can, because 1 out of 4 people will live in Africa by the year 2100. And a rich, prosperous Africa with many nation states will be very difficult for any hostile power to dominate. So we don't have to dominate other regions. We just have to prevent hostile great powers from dominating them. So in the short run, I see balancing against China. In the long run, I think we should at least try to have some sort of concert of powers in a multipolar world, which is no longer bipolar, which maybe India has joined the mix.
Well, thank you so much, Michael Lind. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and it's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.